Images of Africa, as we know, have been tainted throughout history. Up until now, we see images of people living in village huts, mud huts, and it's just a poverty stricken place. By virtue of social media and with mass immigration, we finally understand that Africa isn't as poor as people make it out to seem. It is poor, but naturally, you have poverty in America, in the UK. Poverty exists around the world. Joining us today is my good friend and well experienced traveler around the world, Bushra. Can I get a round of applause? Bushra, someone who's worked in charity sector and has traveled all around the world. What's the deal? Do you believe that the charity sector kind of reinforces negative stereotypes of Africa?
So first of all, I don't consider myself to be super experienced. I'm by no means a seasoned humanitarian aid worker. But I will say
she's been humble.
I will say that I have an active interest in international development and specifically issues around gender justice, child protection, safeguarding, as well as just the general inclusion of the most vulnerable.
She says she's not experienced and she has like a list of 5-6 things that she does.
Yeah, these are the issues I'm interested in. So yeah, going back to your question, I think what I want to put out there first is that when we talk about charity work, there is this profound sense that in a world full of moral uncertainty, there is one idea that is sacred.
Yeah.
And one idea that can't be compromised, and that's the act of giving charity.
Yeah.
So there is even a certain level of pop culture around it. Celebrities and social media influencers proselytize the need for us to give aid, and even Islam, as a Muslim, Islam exhorts me to give charity, and there's substantial references in the Hadith and Quran that kind of remind us of our broader social responsibilities. And definitely, I think the work of fundraisers and aid specialists deserves admiration.
100%.
It definitely deserves admiration. But I think it's kind of embarrassing and even problematic that the discussion around poverty alleviation and charity work is still centered around white voices and white saviorism.
Yeah. Wouldn't you say that the model that we've been given is centered around like the white saviorism model?
So I think, as I was saying, the discussion around poverty alleviation is dominated predominantly by white voices. So just the other day, for example, I was looking at the board of trustees of a very prominent aid agency, and out of 12 trustees, only 2 were people of colour, and this kind of suggests to me that the decision-making powers and the influence over how an aid intervention is designed is kind of dominated by white people.
I mean, the thing is, I don't want this to be like a white bashing podcast, because that's not the intention at all. It's to have a discussion around the practices and maybe the philosophies and kind of understandings of people who go into the charity sector, kind of dissecting the psyche of these organizations. So the thing is, you've raised white voices as almost as if it's a contentious issue. Is it contentious? And if so, why is it?
So I don't think it's a white bashing issue. I think what we need to remember is that humanitarian aid and development in its crudest form is about dissecting the economic, political and social cultural kind of processes of black and brown people and finding them to be regressive, at least in comparison to the so-called progressive North. And so addressing race is very uncomfortable because it reminds us of our colonial past.
Yeah.
And a lot of aid agencies were actually set up during the colonial era.
Okay.
So I think Red Cross and I think Oxfam was also set up during the colonial era. So this means that a lot of their work in places within Asia and Africa was during the colonial era, and it was under the governing structures of colonialism.
So let's talk about the psyche then. I was saying that the psyche of like a lot of these charity sectors is just a continuation, or almost like it's like, okay, colonialists messed up so bad in these parts of the world. Now, what form of redress do we have? The form of redress we have is by setting up aid.
Yeah.
And we can go into how aid is so backwards anyway. We know aid today is problematic because it's not really aid, it's aid with a side hand. It's under, because look at how Haiti had to pay still tax to the colonial French.
Exactly. So I'm just curious about the number of projects that these aid agencies implemented that were actually designed to kind of fix the problems that the colonialists created. Yeah. So there is a deep history there, and it's reflected in some of the cultural practices in aid organizations like reporting structures and recruitment practices.
It is that almost that neoliberal logic though, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's one neoliberalism kind of says it's seeking to redress the issue but without speaking about the symptoms. Yeah. And I find that a lot of these agencies run on that same psyche.
Right. But even like the academic discourse
Yeah.
around aid and international development is dominated by white voices.
Mhm.
So, for example, the most prominent development thinkers I can think of are Jeffrey Sachs and William Easterly.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I was studying for my master's in international development, every single lecturer I had was white, whereas majority of people on my course were people from developing countries. And to me, that's deeply perplexing because it's kind of like us, people from the developing nations, seeking kind of guidance and knowledge from the so-called developed West
Yeah.
on how to confront the issues within our countries.
But the thing is, again, it's like it's very hard for me because I'm someone who's like I find myself in this kind of between a rock and a hard place because I don't want to condemn charities. I think charity work is let's be honest.
Yeah.
If we're going to take the African model, let's say something that I know West Africa. Yes, there's been years of slavery. Yes, there's been years of colonization. Yes, there's been years of unjust taxes, which are all still now contribute to the reason why Africa is left behind. Yeah. However, we can't have a conversation about that and not condemn the leaders of these countries who are corrupt.
Exactly.
They take money from the people. They don't invest in infrastructure. They're corrupt. Even the aid doesn't even go to the people.
Yeah.
So I'm very much pro helping people on the ground. The issue is how it looks. I think social media has a lot to play into that.
Exactly. Before I answer that, I just want to go back and say that this isn't about abandoning the idea of aid. We still need aid.
Of course.
There's conflicts, there's disasters. We need to respond to these. But the issue is that we need to ensure that our aid is appropriate and relevant and actually meets the priorities of the people we're responding to, and that they are actively participating in this, and we're not treating them as if they're passive recipients.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that reflects the white savior complex. Secondly, we need to turn the sector on its head so that we're confronting some of the implicitly racist structures within the sector and moving towards greater localization. And also, for example, employing local people in senior positions.
Exactly.
A typical scenario for me is an American white employee will be sent out into, let's say, a country like Uganda and will be put into a senior management position. They'll receive a hefty salary and they'll also receive room and board. Under him, he'll have Ugandan employees working and reporting to him rather than them being placed in the senior management position, which to me suggests that they're treated as if they are deficient in knowledge or that they lack the relevant expertise. And this kind of reflects the white savior complex to me as well.
As 100%. I feel like also if you look at that, look at social media, you have people going to these countries, and this is something I want to talk about as well.
Yeah.
They go to these countries and take pictures of the kids with themselves, which is cool. Not cool, sorry, I have issues with that, But it's like you're out there trying to highlight the homelessness and the poverty of the countries when, I'm sorry, but we have homelessness we live in Birmingham. Look how people we see homelessness in the street.
Exactly.
Why is that you've gone to Africa, take pictures of homeless people or taking pictures of orphans or people who are poor? I don't understand that.
I think we need to unpack this a bit.
Okay.
So there is an issue within the sector. Your typical scenario is that you have a 20-something male or female, normally white, or even a non-black person of color who's maybe bored of their predictable life in the UK.
Exactly.
And then they decide they're going to volunteer with a charity, go abroad, let's say to...
the intentions are good. You want to do something good. I get that.
They're terribly moved by the poverty that they witness and they decide to do something about it. The charity they work with raises thousands of pounds, they implement a project, and then they're touted as a humanitarian hero, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. But it's not so much the deeds of the volunteers or the aid organizations that are the contenders for ethical judgment. It's more the mindset that justifies it that needs to be reconsidered. So a lot of these aid organizations and volunteers will implement projects that are actually designed to improve the conditions of the community, but the mindset typically reflects the savior complex. So by that I mean the mindset that has its roots in this colonial notion that the West must bestow aid and knowledge upon the underprivileged and uncivilized people of the developing
100%.
nations.
I'm moving slightly away from that. The white savior complex is rife in every single thing, permeates all parts of our society. Look at, we have a movie that's based in China about a Chinese king or a Chinese warrior or whatever it may be, and then they cast a white person to act as the savior.
Yeah, exactly.
And I find it very problematic. But then do you feel like what we're talking about, do you feel like with the advent of social media, it kind of amplifies this mentality?
Absolutely. So we post images of ourselves on social media of our gallant acts of saving the poor.
Yeah.
We post images of rape survivors, of people who are malnourished, people who've escaped conflict and all kinds of tragedies. But it's as if we're almost using their tragedies to bolster our own.
It's almost like people use it as, they say, trauma porn. But the problem is, how do you draw the thin line? Because I have friends who are fundraisers. How do you draw the thin line of naturally the shock factor is what gets people in?
Exactly.
Shock factor is what will get people to donate their money. I get that, yeah. But how do we move from or where's the balance between not just using shock factor and almost using, and I've called it exploitation. How are you exploiting people's tragedy to get money, even though the money that you will raise will help them? But how do we kind of move away from that, but still maintain the act of, still kind of encourage people to give?
Well, I think you've answered it yourself. It's so there's actually three factors here. We need to understand why it's harmful, why it can be harmful.
Mhm.
So one reason is it prevents aid and development aid, for example, for being participatory. So
Okay.
we have people going in with their answers and expertise. They're not necessarily empowering the community. They're not consulting with religious leaders, and often they'll implement projects that may not be culturally appropriate. The second thing is that it creates a sense of paternalism where we're not necessarily, again, developing their capacities, but we're just putting a band-aid on the problems in the community. Thirdly, and this is going back to what you said earlier, it does perpetuate this idea of poverty porn,
Yeah.
where we're taking pictures of, let's say, an African child in a dignified state, and using that to kind of elicit an emotional response to garner donations.
Yeah.
So my first issue is that a lot of these projects, some organizations that, let's say an individual from America will pay thousands of pounds to organizations that are implementing very superficial projects that don't necessarily create the change that the communities need.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I don't, 100%, 100%. My issue with it, again, it's just like, I don't want to be someone who's very negative towards charity. I think charity, again, and I recognize my privilege in this. I'm from a quite aristocrat background in the Gambia. My great grandfather was the president of Gambia. My grandfather was an MP. I traced my lineages to kind of like rich people inside the world. So when I go to Gambia, my experience of Gambia is not even poverty. I don't remember. I think you might see some beggars, for example, on the beach, for example. But again, where I go, I don't even see poverty. So I'm as shocked when I see these organizations that go to places like Gambia and highlight the poverty. I'm shocked myself. But my issue is that it's like, again, how are we going to find this balance of like, Gambia is a very beautiful country at the same time, and the images of Gambia. If you're not a Gambian now living in the West, all you think is Gambia is just complete poverty.
Exactly.
And I find that very problematic. And I'm like, but again, how do we find that balance? For me, it's like my initial kind of red flag, or what I see to be a red flag straight away, is that if you go to Gambia and you don't take any Gambians with you, I find it's a red flag. I think it's extremely problematic. So let's talk a bit about your personal experience. Have you witnessed anything yourself that you find to be problematic on your kind of, when you go out on these trips?
I have,
practices.
But some of the most disturbing things I've seen are when I wasn't present. Some of the things I've seen on social media. So, for example, I've seen an image of an aid worker squatting down and holding her hands out at a child that is uncovered. Wow. So that immediately raises a child protection concern to me and a safeguarding issue, and the child is crying. And that image was taken to kind of, again, evoke an emotional reaction. Yeah. But at the same time, this is very prevalent. Fortunately for me, I work for an organisation that has policies in place. Good. We're not allowed to take images of children, typically without parental consent, and I also don't work in marketing.
But even then, like, the thing is, like, again, I'm trying to find, I don't want to judge anyone's intentions. I can't open someone's chest and see why I've done it, but I do find it a bit suspect. Like, what are you getting out of posting on your personal social media?
Again, it depends on the nature of the
image, isn't it? I find like if the kids are playing and happy and laughing, I think that's quite cute. Different, But then you have a lot of these influencers who go out there and literally it's almost as if like they're using black people as props.
Yeah, exactly. And usually they're people in the most distressed
Exactly. That's very strange.
That's not something that should be allowed.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't like to post an image of your family member or your child.
Exactly. So why is it allowed? It's almost like you really are removing the humanity of these people, and I find that very, very strange. Yeah. Again, you go out and you're playing football with the kids. I think that's very cute. Yeah. Again, if you're active on social media anyway, something for me, for example, I would post what I'm doing anyway. That makes sense. But I will never go to Africa and post images of poverty and poverty-stricken households. Because I'm thinking, hang on a minute, I can go to flipping Stratford Road and see beggars.
Yeah, exactly.
I can see my own backyard and see beggars. I can go to town and see rough sleepers. Why would I do that in another country? I don't understand that. What are you getting out of that? That's my issue with a lot of charity sector and what I've seen within it.
I think we need to go back to the mindset of why this happens, and I think it's important to go back to the link between colonialism and aid agencies and why this is the imagery around poor African children, but particularly in Oxfam adverts back in the 90s was so prevalent. So colonialism, and I think this is very important to unpack, and I'll explain why in a bit. It did create the conditions for bad governments and failed
Of course, oh,
states.
that we can talk about all day.
Yeah, it did. So, for example, India had the most devastating famines during British colonial rule, even though it's touted as a success story because of railways.
Yeah. And you seen that funny meme, innit? When I'm in the flipping, I'm in my casket, and someone goes, "But they built the railways." I'm like, "I get back up," like Undertaker.
At your funeral.
At my funeral, listen. Yeah. It's like someone put the other day. Someone put, how would you tweet out something that will let your friends know that you're in distress, but saying you're in distress? And I retweeted twice. And the first one, I would say all lives matter. Yeah. And everyone was like, and the minute I said all lives matter, everyone, are you okay? Is everything okay at home? What's going on? Or if I said they built the railways though.
Yeah.
I would say, but anyway, carry on, sorry.
Yeah. So what was I saying? Yeah.
So
I'm just thinking of another example. So I think under Belgian rule in the Democratic Republic of Congo,
Leopold.
So the worst mortality rates at the time, probably due to widespread disease, but also because of the coercive, brutal labour practices of the Belgian officials. Mm-hmm. Back then, the colonialists had the same sort of characteristics as a lot of aid workers nowadays. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on every aid worker. I'm myself, I'm an aid worker, my husband is. But this mindset, it's important to confront this mindset. So back then they had the same characteristics like excessive self-confidence, coercive top-down planning, and also lack of knowledge of local conditions and lack of respect for cultural traditions. And also back then, so decolonization didn't help the situation either. So when
like independence,
it didn't help. It actually brought further mayhem on the countries, because the colonials, they drew up boundaries with no regard for ethnic and linguistic lines, and they also appointed governments with no popular legitimacy.
Yeah, East Africa, a good example of that.
Exactly, and this caused a lot of problems. Back then, they decided what a boundary was, what a country was, who got the land, and that. But
that, to be fair, that is like the imperial project around the world.
Right.
Look at Cuba. Look at all these places around the world. We always find that the bourgeoisie are always going to be amongst the minority.
Exactly.
And they don't want to give legitimacy to rule. And naturally, people rebel against that. That's the imperial project around the world. But in speaking about this, you mentioned Belgium. So we know Belgium has a history of human zoos.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, I don't want to attack and genocide. Yeah, that's King Leopold. But we can talk about. I think we should dedicate. It's funny how in the Western we always hear about Hitler. Obviously, he was a disastrous murderer. But no one knows his about King Leopold, who killed more people than Hitler did. Yeah, but again, I don't want to compare trauma, so that's another topic for another day. But again, talking about Belgium and human zoos, I don't want to compare the influence to that, but it does give me that vibe.
It does.
Like this almost this show and tell of human
it's like I said,
bodies.
The characteristics they have are very similar to a lot of
it's the same mindset, isn't it?
Development aid specialists. Exactly. So going back to what I was saying, so the West imposed its map of the world on a court of different linguistic, religious, ethnic groups, which often bred conflict. And as you know, conflict breeds poverty. And
of course.
What you were saying about the imperial project, I'm not saying that it's because of the West drawing these boundaries that conflict is happening. I mean, I think it's impossible for a utopia to exist no matter how they drew the boundaries. Conflict would always exist.
Yeah.
But they did create the conditions for this. And they created the conditions for hatred amongst different tribes. So a good example of this is the 1994 Rwandan genocide.
Yeah.
So back in 1994, members of the Hutu ethnic group killed as many as 800,000 members of the Tutsi ethnic group. The common narrative is that one day a group of frenzied Africans picked up a machete and they started attacking members of different ethnic. But this explanation does nothing but it's devoid of historical context, and it also reinforces Western prejudices.
100%. Did you just to interject there? But did you hear what Terry Crews said about this?
No.
You know who Terry Crews is, yeah?
Terry Crews,
yeah, the white chicks guy.
No, yeah, I know him.
Yeah, so he goes, we talk about white supremacy, but we don't talk about black supremacy, and he gives the Rwandan genocide as an example.
Yeah, but this is where he's wrong.
Exactly.
So first of all, that understanding masks decades of colonial history. It also kind of absolves the role of European colonizers in watering the hatred between the tribes.
Exactly.
So back then, the Belgian officials, they instituted divisive ethnicity-based policies between the different ethnic groups. The tribes. So, for example, members of the Hutu ethnic group were characterized as having broad features and wider noses, for example, and therefore they were classified as uncivilized, whereas members of the Tutsi ethnic group were classified as slender looking, more European looking, and therefore more civilized.
Yeah.
So this kind of laid the foundation for the genocide and the hatred between the two ethnic groups.
So even people like to talk about, again, Terry Crews saying that this is an example of black supremacy is bogus, because really and truly the reason why the genocide even took place was because of how these arbitrary lines that were drawn by the colonialists fueled the conditions
fostered the conditions for conflict. And you know what the irony is, that going forward to 1994, the aid agencies that were responding to the genocide actually reinforced some of the structural violence in the camps through various actions that they did inadvertently. So, for example, a lot of aid agencies, through various actions, for example, recruiting predominantly Tutsi staff in positions in refugee camps, they heightened the tensions between the two different groups. And that meant that the Hutu ethnic group, for example, they consolidated power within the refugee camps to launch attacks within the camp. But the aid agencies actually fostered the conditions for that to happen by heightening the tension between the two different ethnic groups. This represents a typical problem in the aid sector. A lot of Westerners going into countries, no understanding of the local conflict dynamics, little interrogation into those dynamics, they end up causing more problems with their decision making. Wow. So, and again, this just exemplifies why the white savior complex can actually be overtly harmful without them even realizing.
See, that was just a whole history lesson. You guys hearing that was gold. I learned so much myself right there. And just kind of in finishing up and finally then, if you were to set up an aid organization or give advice to people who are thinking of going, so let's do two. What would your aid organization look like? And secondly, what advice would you give to people who are going out there?
Okay, so what an aid organization that I would set up would look like. So for me, it would be as local as possible and as international as necessary. Okay. So I'm a big believer in localization. Okay. So recently, the formal humanitarian system introduced, I wouldn't say introduced, but they've urged this idea that we need to move towards greater localization. And this is this idea that we need to allocate more funding towards local community-based organizations and give them more influence over project design and more funding. Of course, this means that the local employees have more power and influence over aid interventions. Historically, this has been a challenge for various reasons. So, for example, often local capacity has been blamed, but also the fact that we're victims of an overly professional humanitarian system that requires us to write reports in perfectly written English. But I think this just marginalizes local voices. And we need to recognize that it's the local people who are the experts. They're the first to respond to the disasters when they strike. International aid specialists come in later. So they understand the conflicts, they understand the disasters, they understand how to respond, they understand their communities, they understand the cultural intricacies. And I think if I was to set up an organization, it would be focused on employing local staff, local knowledge, and responding appropriately to the priorities of the community, as opposed to treating them as passive recipients of aid. So, and in terms of advice
given people who want to go up there, you know, again, it's very noble. I don't want to. It's been somewhat. People might get the impression that I've been somewhat negative, and again, I have my view because of what I've seen, and I find it very personal because as well what I've seen taking place in Gambia. So I'm very much like, I can't stand the organization. So I get that. But again, someone's 18, 19, 20, whatever age this person may be, even older. It's a very noble thing of wanting to help. Let's not like kind of diminish that role or play that role down. Someone wanting to help, someone getting ready to willing to leave their country, willing to leave their comfortability to go out and help in a country which they think is in need is very noble. However, I feel like if you're gonna, let's say like you're designing a booklet or some top tips of people who want to go from the West to these countries, what are you gonna say to them? What will be in this booklet?
Okay, so definitely I agree with you. It is very noble, and the work of volunteers and aid workers definitely deserves admiration, but I do also feel like the Grinch pointing out what I consider to be a tragedy. Knowing that there is so much goodwill and potential amongst people engaged in charity work, the advice I think I would give is to understand the community that you're going to. Understand them, understand their culture.
So beforehand, so that's first tip, before you go out, research where you're going to and a bit about the people.
So
what else would you say? What advice would you give them? I would say, just to interject there, I would say take your phone with you, but before you post anything, ask yourself what it looks like and why am I posting this truly? That's just my thing.
I would also say understand your role understand that you're there to cooperate with the people and to work with them. You're not. I think that there's a common understanding that we are, or it's very explicit actually. We believe that it's our duty to go out there and save these people, and that they're actually waiting for somebody from the West to come. But we need to understand that we're working in partnership with them, and we need to cooperate with them. And this means recognizing that the community you're working with has different capacities and knowledge that can be of use, that should be used, and also consulting different stakeholders in a community. You have to think about people with disabilities, women, children, all of these people have different priorities. And we definitely need to be consulting with people who have influence in the community, like religious leaders, community leaders, and so forth. And thirdly, I think what's really important is when you're going out there, I know it's difficult and it's hard to resist taking images of the people we're working with, but we need to remember you wouldn't like treating your relatives like this. You wouldn't want to put images of your relatives in a distressed state. It's quite simple.
It's almost like literally it sounds basic, but almost like do unto others you'd like to happen to yourself. It's almost that simple as that, isn't it?
I think we just need to be conscious of the image that we're projecting on social media. We don't want to be treating these people as if they're uncivilized and that they're distressed and they're waiting for somebody from the West to come and save them. They're individuals with capacities, with a voice, and they need to be respected as such.
And ultimately, it's not like it's their fault they're in the situation that they're in. Do you know what I mean? We shouldn't go out there like, oh, these people, we're here to save these people because they've put themselves in the situation and, we're going to bring them out of it. It's like, no, they find themselves in a situation that's out of their control. And now, how best can I be in a position that's going to help them?
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant, man. Well, that was an informative, quite heavy topic, quite a heavy show actually. Hope you guys enjoyed that. I'll post Bushra's socials in the comments. Check them out. As always, peace until next time. Take care.